All right, so we're diving deep today. You know how this works. You send us something thought-provoking, and we dive in. This time, it's from Peter Duke over at thedukephoto.com. Journalist, researcher, the whole bit.
Yeah, Peter Duke. Always interesting. This piece, in the beginning, was the operating system. It really caught my eye. It came out, let's see, March 31st, 2025.
Not exactly light reading. Duke himself clocks it at 40 to 51 minutes. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To unpack this stuff.
Totally. And he's getting into some pretty heady territory. Linguistic Christianity is what he's calling it.
And before anyone jumps to conclusions, we're not talking about, religious dogma here.
No, not at all. Duke's coming at this from, a structural analysis angle. He's looking at the witness gospels, right?
Right. But through these very specific lenses, Greek linguistics, so how the language itself works, epistemology, which is, the study of how we know what we know at all.
And the way those dialogues, the way they're structured, the patterns there.
Exactly. And what I find interesting is you don't have to be, a believer in any particular faith to find Duke's approach insightful.
Yeah, it's more about looking at how these texts, particularly the words attributed to Jesus, function as a system. What's the internal logic?
And it all comes down to this Greek term, logos. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but,
We'll do our best.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's central to Duke's whole argument. And his take is, it's pretty bold. He says that famous line from John, "In the beginning was the Word." It's not mystical or metaphorical.
It's meant to be taken literally, as in a literal description of reality itself, but viewed through this, linguistic lens.
Exactly. So we got to ask, right, what does Duke actually mean by logos? Because it's clearly not just, a word floating out there in space.
No, it's much more active. It's the way we experience everything, at least according to Duke. Our reasoning, communication, learning, even deception.
It's all happening through this process of socks, making distinctions, conveying meaning, the whole 9 yards. It's the bedrock, our operating system, so to speak.
So that's our mission for today, then, unpacking linguistic Christianity. What is logos, and what does it tell us about, everything? Truth, language, the world we live in, the big questions.
Big questions indeed. And to tackle them, we got to start with that word itself, logos. Duke makes a big deal out of how it's often translated, simplified really, as just the word. Why does that matter so much to him?
Because it loses its punch, its dynamism. It becomes this flat, static thing, a noun. He even uses the technical term nominalization, turning a process into a thing.
So instead of understanding logos as something that's happening, we get stuck on this fixed label.
Exactly. And then we miss the whole point. And if you actually look at the definitions, like the real deal from the Little Scott lexicon, the word doesn't even come close.
Oh, it's a whole universe in that word. Calculation, relation, proportion, argument, law, inward debate. The list goes on and on.
Seriously, it's huge, a page is long. But Duke's point is, all these meanings, they all have something in common.
Distinction. The act of separating, of making differences. That's the core of logos.
This fundamental tool we're all using whether we realize it or not. Sorting signal from noise, truth from lie, aligning things, finding contradictions. That's how language works, right? To make sense of things, to create order.
Not just spoken language either. Duke's talking about thinking itself, reasoning, figuring things out, the internal process. And then there's the structure of systems, the way things fit together, the logic, all logos. So much more than just the word.
Way more. And Duke gives a shout out to E. Michael Jones, his book, Logos Rising. Jones, he's done a ton of work on the philosophy of culture and all that.
So this mistranslation, reducing logos to just the word verbum in Latin, why is that so problematic? What's the danger there?
Well, Duke says it basically neuters the concept. You lose the action, the function. It becomes this, mystical title detached from how we actually use language to make sense of the world.
And that has huge consequences for how we interpret things, right? Hermeneutics, that whole field.
Huge. Because instead of logos being this tool for, precision, for clarity, it gets wrapped up in symbolism and abstractions. We get further and further away from what the words actually do.
And that creates this gap. If you don't have a background in ancient Greek, you're basically relying on these secondary interpretations.
Which might have their own agendas, right? Institutional biases, theological baggage, whatever.
And Duke takes it even further. He calls it epistemological warfare.
Which is a fancy way of saying the battle over how we know what's true.
And by abstracting logos, by making it this vague and mystical thing, you basically disarm people. They can't directly verify meaning for themselves anymore.
They have to rely on the experts, the interpreters. And that, my friend, is how you control the narrative.
So Duke wants to cut through all that, go back to the source, the original Greek, and he says, look at how Jesus embodies Logos. How does that work exactly?
It's not just that Jesus is called Logos, right? It's that he does Logos. He reasons, he questions, he reframes arguments.
He's calling out BS, basically, pointing out contradictions, using logic.
And he does it with incredible precision, like a surgeon with words. Duke points to how Jesus actually listens to people, then responds in a way that cuts through the noise.
And those parables, they're not just stories, they're like logic puzzles. Duke calls them open code, designed to make you think, to test your own understanding.
It's like he's revealing the structure of thought itself. And Duke sees this linguistic integrity as central to who Jesus is.
It's all about clarity. No tricks, no manipulation, just clear, coherent communication rooted in Logos.
Which brings us to that famous line, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Duke connects that directly back to the internal consistency of Locke's. How so?
Well, if Logos leads to alignment, to like the underlying structure of reality, and Jesus speaks consistently with that alignment,
then he is the way, because he embodies that principle.
he is the truth. Because his language, it doesn't deviate from what's real, from what's actually true.
And the life, because that clarity, that alignment, it brings things back to life, in a way. Brings life back to, like, our understanding of things.
Revitalizes it.
Right. And then there's the passion narrative. Jesus' trial, crucifixion, the whole thing. Duke sees that through this linguistic lens, too. How does that work?
It's like this clash of narratives. You got the false witnesses, the mob mentality, all this manipulated language being thrown around. And then you have Jesus, calm, collected, still operating by the principles of Logos.
Refusing to get drawn into the distortion, the rhetoric, even when his life's on the line.
And even the phrase Logos incarnate, Duke points out that it could be, nominalized, like it could become this static thing, this title.
Because by becoming incarnate, Logos takes on a human form. It's limited, in a way.
Bounded by human constraints.
So for Logos to keep doing its thing, for the process to continue, Duke says it has to overcome those limitations.
Death and resurrection, they're not just these theological events. They have a linguistic logic to them, too.
Looking free from that limited human form. Coming back to life, so to speak. This is blowing my mind. So if Logos is this mechanism for clarity, like, what are the signs? How can we tell if someone's operating with it or against it?
Duke gives us some clues. Language that's clear, proportional, grounded in reality. Explanations that actually explain things, not just obscure them.
Genuine dialogue, where people are actually listening to each other, not just waiting to talk or trying to score points.
Statements that are internally consistent, balanced, ratio, proportion, that kind of thing. And then inward debate.
Which is like honest self-reflection, questioning your own assumptions.
Clear definitions. So we're all on the same page. And then really importantly, open-ended questions. Questions that invite exploration, not just confirmation.
So like instead of did you do X, it's what happened.
Exactly, that kind of thing. Language that fosters understanding, that encourages critical thinking instead of demanding blind belief.
Okay, so that's the luck side. What about the other side? The anti-Luxa stuff.
Duke calls out a whole bunch of manipulative tactics. It's a long list. But let's start with nominalization.
Turning processes into things, like we were talking about before.
Noema, for example.
Right.
Duke uses that as an example. The idea of thinking, the process of it, gets reduced to this static noun.
And then there's the cause-effect stuff, like silence is violence.
Making these grand pronouncements about causation without actually demonstrating the link.
Double binds, those are fun.
Yeah.
Setting things up so no matter what you choose, you're wrong. Lesser of two evils, that whole thing.
Presuppositions, sneaking in assumptions within questions.
Like, since you did X, does that mean you also Y?
Loaded language. Vague terms that are designed to trigger an emotional response.
Extremist, science-based, those kinds of words.
And then universal quantifiers. The always, never, everyone knows stuff.
Overgeneralizing, shutting down nuance. So basically, it's all about creating the illusion of reasoning without actually doing the work.
Appealing to emotions, social pressure, whatever it takes to bypass critical thinking. And Duke says, recognizing these tactics, it's crucial, especially now with all this information warfare going on.
Because if you're not paying attention, you get trained to distrust your own reasoning. You start looking to external authorities for all the answers.
And that's the goal, right? To control not just what people think, but how they think, to make them dependent.
Which brings us to the Paschal mystery. death, resurrection, rebirth. Duke offers this really interesting take on it as a kind of internal epistemological process.
Like a purification of understanding. He says it mirrors what happens when we engage with logos, with truth.
So the death part, that's when we let go of false beliefs, those things we've been clinging to that just don't hold up anymore.
We encounter contradictions, see things more clearly, and that old way of thinking, it has to die.
Duke has this great image of logos as a scythe, cutting away those distortions.
And then resurrection. That's when the mind starts to rebuild itself around a more solid foundation.
Things become clearer, we can define things more precisely. It's like our agency comes back online. We're not just repeating what we've been told anymore.
And rebirth. That's the ongoing process, living in that renewed state of understanding, constantly questioning, refining, aligning ourselves with truth.
Duke also re-examines the term Christ, Christos in Greek. He suggests it might not be a divine title, but more of a functional descriptor, like anointed one.
Not something you're born with, but something you become.
Through this process of embodying logos, and he points out that in ancient Greek, becoming a Christos, it wasn't about being chosen by God or anything like that.
It was about fulfilling a specific role, demonstrating skill and mastery.
So in Duke's framework, the Christ, it's what emerges when logos has done its work. When someone has purged the distortion, the falsehood, and is living in alignment with truth.
Not a static identity, but a state of being. And that brings us to the Hegelian hijack.
Which sounds ominous.
It is. Duke contrasts this internal Pascal process with the externalized dialectic.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that whole thing.
Or problem, reaction, solution. Same idea, different packaging. And the key difference is, while the Pascal process is about aligning with truth, the Hegelian model is often about manufacturing conflict.
To drive us towards a predetermined outcome. And that outcome, it's not necessarily about truth at all.
No, it's about control, shaping perceptions, managing the narrative.
Duke even uses the LA fires as an example.
Remember those? Back in January 2025.
Yeah.
Duke lost his home in those fires. Tragic situation.
Terrible. And he points out how it all fits the Hegelian script perfectly. Sudden disaster, mass panic, and then boom, the prepackaged solution appears. More centralized control.
LA strong. Sounds good on the surface, right?
Sure. But it's all engineered. It's a manufactured crisis leading to a predetermined outcome.
And in this kind of system, language becomes a tool for manipulation. It's not about understanding anymore. It's about control.
So instead of genuine debate, we get these staged arguments, these controlled narratives.
Rebellion itself gets co-opted.
And people are trained to think in these simplistic binaries, to outsource their critical thinking to the experts.
So instead of genuine transformation, what we get is this counterfeit.
A hollowed-out version of change.
And Duke calls it the Antichrist structure, because it replaces the organic process of logos with this manipulated substitute.
And this ties into Duke's whole idea about the continuity of empire.
He says Rome never really fell. It just morphed, adapted.
The church, finance, globalism, it's all the same beast, just wearing different masks.
And language, it's the tool that holds it all together. Titles, doctrines, legal contracts, all designed to consolidate power and disguise its true nature.
An empire, Duke argues, it hates clarity, because clarity exposes the mechanisms of control.
So modern technocracy, with its UNs and its WFs and its NGOs.
It's Rome 2.0, basically, wielding power through narratives and controlled language.
And Duke specifically calls out the Berggruen Institute.
Those guys.
He sees them as a key player in this whole Neo-Venetian web thing.
Which is like epistemological warfare on a global scale, manipulating perceptions, controlling information, classic Venetian strategy.
And the modern oligarchy, they're clever. They shed the old forms of empire, the outward appearances.
But the logic remains the same. Control the medium of distinction, control language, and you control everything.
Duke introduces this MICE plus F framework to explain it.
Money, ideology, coercion, ego, family.
It's the hidden structure of empire, the logic behind modern finance, the way they control our lives.
And it all leads to what he calls soft totalitarianism, order without clarity, structure without logos.
A command and control tyranny, where language itself is used to obscure and redirect meaning. But here's the good news. Duke reminds us that logos, it's not some esoteric concept.
It's our native operating system, the way we're wired to think, to understand the world.
And who's the best at it? Kids. Before they get all messed up by the system.
Exactly. And that's why Jesus puts the child at the center. It's about reclaiming that natural clarity, that inherent honesty in how we use language.
Duke even gives a fresh take on the Beatitudes. He sees them as expressions of living in alignment with Logos.
Poor in spirit is about being open to new information, not clinging to old beliefs. Meekness is about being a good listener.
And Duke's point is, the way forward isn't about inventing something new. It's about restoring what we've lost.
Unlearning all the BS, coming back to a place of linguistic integrity and precision.
Speaking our truth clearly and honestly. So, linguistic Christianity, as Duke lays it out.
It's about recognizing the fundamental difference between logos and anti-logos.
Two completely different operating systems, one based on clarity, the other on deception.
And following Jesus in this framework, it's not about joining a church or believing a certain doctrine. It's about taking up what Duke calls the cross of structural integrity.
Undergoing that internal Pascal process, shading the falsehood, and speaking truth with precision.
The real battle, he says, it's being fought in the realm of language, between those who clarify and those who conceal.
And the kingdom, it's not a place. It's a way of speaking, a way of thinking that starts with Logos.
So there you have it, folks. Peter Duke's Linguistic Christianity. It's a lot to chew on, but the core message is clear.
Log matters. It's our defense against manipulation, our way of navigating this increasingly complex world.
And we all have it within us. It's there, in that childlike curiosity, that unfiltered way of seeing the world.
You just have to reclaim it.
So as you go about your day, ask yourself this. Are you operating with Logos? Are you seeking clarity, alignment with what's real? Or are you letting yourself be manipulated by the anti-Logos forces out there?
Think about it. How you use language, it matters.
Big time. Duke has a ton more to say about all this on thedukereport.com. Go check it out, dive in, see what you think.
It's worth the time, trust me.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, stay curious.
And stay vigilant.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.